Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us today at Michael's. I'm excited to craft with all of you. We are going to be making some fun abstract embroidery. And embroidery is one of my personal favorite hobbies and crafts. You can make it all sorts of fun things with it. You can see on these, we just have some fun little kind of abstract shapes or little stitches around the edges. We also did some little beads added on there. Can do lots of different types of stitches we're going to go over today. And so I'm going to go through all of our different supplies we're going to be using to get started. First, we are using an embroidery hoop. So I have a couple different sizes here. Excuse my little cables. A couple different sizes. They also come in plastic options, so any of those are fine to use. You can use smaller or bigger hoops. It doesn't matter the size. You can obviously fill the entire hoop with different embroidery stitches, or you can just do a couple little designs inside. And then we're going to be using some felt. So I have felt backers here that are Creatology brand from Michaels. You can also use burlap or what's called fiddler's cloth a lot of times. This is sort of like a thicker woven material. It's got little, almost like square holes through it. So this is actually the DMC fiddler's cloth from Michaels, but you can also use burlap. And the perk of using something like this is that it has a thicker weave, as so you can see, like in the window, you can see through it here, versus something like felt, you can't, and it's going to be a thicker material. If you're going to be using felt, then you do need to be using an embroidery needle, which is going to be much sharper. And we put some of these notes on, I know the class sign up. So these might not be the best needles to use for little hands. If you're crafting with an adult today, then you definitely can. But if you use burlap or fiddler's cloth, then you can use our Creatology plastic needles. So if you're going to use felt, then these plastic needles will be much harder to push through the felt. It'll probably just poke like a bigger hole through it versus just like piercing it slightly. But the plastic needle will work great with the burlap material. Or you can use a thinner needle, a sharper needle, and then use that on the felt. I'm going to be doing both options, so we'll go through some stitches in either way. So it's totally up to you and what you're comfortable using. And then we're using some embroidery floss. So I have some of our Creatology friendship bracelet kits. It's just embroidery floss that's inside of these. We've got some other fun details to do bracelet making as well, but it's ultimately just embroidery floss. And so we're going to be using these. I'll show you how to divide these if you don't want it to be as thick. Oftentimes, if you're doing intricate details with embroidery, little details, you might want to divide this into smaller pieces instead of all of the different layers of thread. So we'll go through all of that. And then we are using some scissors. And if you want to add beads, any beads of your choice. I just have these fun Creatology star beads that are iridescent and really cute to add with all sorts of colors, but you could use any type of bead that you want. And then lastly, a couple optional tools that are great are a water erasable pin. These are great to have on hand if you like embroidery and get into it, then these are really fun that you can draw on any sort of fabric and then it can wash out. So you can follow this, trace anything you want, and then you just have to kind of soak it in water once you're done embroidering and all the blue ink will disappear. And then there's also this great little tool here, kind of hard to see, but it's got a funny little wire tip or these little hooks on either end. And this helps to thread your needle if you have trouble doing that. So I'll show you how to use this tool. It's sometimes can be a little bit tricky to use, but I think it's a fun one to have. And these are kind of more advanced tools as you get going with embroidery. If you start liking it and you want to do more, then these will help you practice. So I just always like to show maybe some other advanced stuff. Once you get the basics today, then you can get going and add to your embroidery kit. So I think that's everything we're going to be using. Primarily, you're going to just want your embroidery hoop. If you don't have an embroidery hoop, you can still embroider on fabric. It just sometimes is a little bit trickier. It's not quite as pulled tight. And so just can be maybe a little bit more frustrating to learn sometimes, to be honest, but you can still do it without a hoop. So don't worry that if you don't have a hoop, as long as you have fabric and needle and thread, then we can embroider together. So I'm going to flip my camera around so you guys can see my hands, and we'll get started. And since we're not using a ton of materials today, I blew through those pretty quickly. So let me know if you guys have any questions as we get going, maybe about other suggestions or different materials you might be using at home. I always love to know what you are making. So if you're using something different, pop it in the Q&A and let us know. Okay, so to get started, again, we're going to go through using felt or using like a burlap style material. So I'm going to start with our burlap material and our plastic needles. And so I have a piece of our cloth here. And like I said, you can see here that it's a thicker weave so that you can use a thicker needle through this material. And so to set our fabric in our hoop, you have your wooden or plastic hoop. Either one is totally fine. And again, any size is fine to use. This one's like an 8-inch, and this one is a 4-inch. So either size or style works the same. And at the top of your embroidery hoop, you have this little screw here. You have to unscrew this and just kind of twist to unscrew it a little bit. You want to loosen this, as you can see as I'm unscrewing this. It's making this grow a little bit so that my center hoop can come out. So your embroidery hoop has 2 pieces. You've got this perfectly round one that doesn't have your little locking mechanism at the top, and then you have this one. This is going to be your top layer, and this one that is a solid hoop is going to go on the back. So what you can do is take your solid hoop and put it behind your fabric. And then you're going to take this hoop and put it on top. So just kind of trap it in the middle here and then press down. So you can see my hoop on the back. And then I've got my hoop on the front that has my little screw lock at the top. And then this isn't tight yet. I haven't screwed it together. So I'm going to start by twisting the screw at the top, the opposite direction we did to loosen it, and start to tighten it a little bit. And then just gently pull your fabric to make sure that your edges aren't rippled. Don't pull it so tight that you are like changing the weave or stretching it. You just want to pull it tight enough that you don't have any ripple or like loose gathering fabric. So just give it little gentle tugs around the edges. And then tighten that a little bit more. And I like to just set it so that this is pretty even along the edges. If this is pushing too far forward or back, and that your 2 hoops aren't aligned, it won't hurt your embroidery. It just sometimes can slip off, which is totally okay too. If your embroidery hoop for some reason comes apart while you're in the middle of stitching, you can just put it back together. It's not going to hurt your project at all. We're going to, of course, take this off the hoop afterward. Well, I said of course, but you don't have to actually. Like I did with this one here, I actually trimmed all the extra fabric and then glued that down on the back. You could always cover this, but you could leave it in the hoop and then hang it. It's like a little built-in picture frame if you wanted to. Or you can take it out of the hoop and then trim your artwork afterward and either frame it or attach it to a shirt or a blanket or whatever you are embroidering. And you can do this for once you get the hang of things after today and you get excited about embroidering, you can use an embroidery hoop on any other material as well. So maybe you have a jacket or a pillowcase or something that you want to embroider. You can take your hoop and put it on any of your fabric that you want to. So just put that denim jacket right in the middle, or you can take a little hoop and you can put it on the edge of your pant leg if you want to do some fun little details on your clothes, or like I said, pillowcases if you want to do monogram things on anything like that. All right, so we're then going to start with our plastic needles. So I'm using my Creatology plastic needles here. And you can see that we've got on your standard needles, you have your eye of your needle, which is the hole, and then you have the tip. And the plastic needles, they do have a little bit of a point still so that they'll be able to gently pierce through any fabric, but they're not so pointy that they're going to injure yourself. And then the eye of your needle is going to be quite a bit larger than a traditional sewing needle so that you can use larger materials like yarn even. And it's much easier to practice learning how to set your thread in your needle. All right, and then we've got all of our colors here. You can use any color that you might want. I'm going to pull out some of this blue to start with. And I'm going to pull off a little bit of yarn or thread here. You don't need a ton. You can always cut it off and then still use it. So I'm going to pull off like 2 feet and then cut it off from the rest of my little skein of thread there. And then to start, we're just going to do some basic stitches to start, and then we can talk about splitting thread and things like that as well. But to start, you're going to take one end of your thread and you're going to push it through the eye of your needle and then pull it down a little bit so that then your thread is going through your needle. And on the other end, we're going to tie a knot. And so we're going to make a little circle, a little loop with our thread. And then the little tail that's overlapping, you're going to go under and through the circle and then pull that tight. Do that again here. We're going to tie this a couple times, especially if you're using our burlap or cloth with the thicker little holes and thicker weave. You're going to want to make sure that we do a couple of knots to get our knot bigger so that it doesn't fall through our fabric. So again, we're going to make a little loop, overlap that little tail, go under and through your circle. We're going to do that again. Again, we're making just like a little triple knot. Just want to give it a little bit of a larger knot so that it doesn't come through our fabric. You can trim off that little tail if you want to. And then you are ready to start embroidering. So with embroidery, since we're starting with our tail that has a knot on the end, we want that knot to be on the back side of our fabric, which means we're going to pierce our needle through the back and pull it forward so that this is on the back side. So pick up your embroidery, your fabric and your hoop. You're going to take your needle and you're going to go from the back and you're going to press through the fabric and then pull that until it hits the knot. So now you have a little knot on the back there. And then we've pulled all of our thread and needle forward. And in our class today, we're just talking about different types of stitches and doing more of some abstract styles. So this is really an abstract little piece of artwork. If you want to draw out a specific style or a certain picture that you want to try to embroider or word, you can definitely do that. But we're just going to kind of play around a little bit, and it's just, you can do anything that you want. And so that's why I kind of just started a little high, but kind of in the middle of my embroidery and in the middle of my hoop here. And then you can just make some stitches. So to do your next stitch, I'm just going to do kind of like a long little line in the middle. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pierce it through and then pull it from the back side. And there I have my first long stitch here. So you can see on the back, I've got my little knot from where we started, and then I pulled through the back, which means now to go back to the front, I'm going to pierce from the back to the front. And I'm pulling my thread fairly tight, but not like tugging it. So I want it to just be kind of gently pulled. I want it to go all the way for the back, so I don't have any like loose yarn like this. You can pull a little bit tighter, but just enough so that you don't have any extra kind of hanging to make a nice clean line. And then from the back, I'm gonna pierce through the back and pull from the front. And I'm gonna kind of do some zigzag stitches. And so you can kind of see, you can see through this, you can see my hand a little bit through my fabric. And so you can kind of see where your last stitches were. And so you can decide from the back where you want it to go. But once you start embroidering more and more, I very rarely flip my embroidery hoop over. Instead, I kind of feel from the back, and you can see I'm kind of just barely pressing my needle to make a little dent. And you kind of go from feel of where you think you want your needle to be. And as it starts to come through, like, oh, that's not where I wanted it, you can pull it back out and pop it back over to where you want it and then pull through. And as you get a few stitches in, you just want to make sure that your thread isn't coming out of your eye of your needle. Back here. And again, we're just making shapes and stitches and lines right now. Just kind of practice playing with the fabric. As you get toward the end of the thread that you cut off, you can tie a knot on the back. And I like to tie a knot with my needle and in between my stitches. So I'm going to take my needle and go underneath a stitch or two and kind of loop it around a couple times. My thread fell out of my needle, so I'm going to pop that back through the eye of my needle. Kind of like to loop it around some of the existing stitches on the back. And then before you pull it all the way through, you have a little loop there. Pull your needle through that loop. And it makes a little knot. We're going to do that a few times, so don't worry about if you didn't see it all. So you can see on the front here, just got the start of some different little lines. And I'm going to switch to a different color. Again, pulling a couple of feet off. So I just cut like 2 feet or so off of my purple thread, and we're going to push that through the eye of my needle again and pull that just a little bit. I like to pull it through at least a good 6 to 8 inches. You want to make sure that the end of your thread isn't so close to the eye of your needle that every time you pull it, it falls out of your needle. You have to keep putting it back in, and that doesn't save you very much time and can be a little bit frustrating. So pull it down enough so that this end of your thread is a good distance from the end of your needle, especially when you have all this extra to work with. As you get closer to the end of your thread, you can kind of pull it down as you go, but that will keep it from falling off easily. And then we're going to tie a knot on the other end of your thread. So again, I'm going to do a little loop at the bottom here. Take my tail, go underneath and through the loop, and then pull tight. And then do that again. You're going to do a double or a triple knot. So do it again, kind of on top of the first knot you tied. Do one more. And you can kind of see my little loop here. Loop it around. My little tail is on top of this portion of the thread. And then lift it up, tuck that tail underneath and through the loop and pull tight. Then you got a nice little knot there. Trim off the extra. And then we can start doing some more stitches. So again, we're going to make sure that the knot's on the back side of our artwork. So we're going to take our needle and stitch from the back first. I'm going to push through the back. So my needle coming through, and then pull that until it hits the knot. And then I'm going to overlap some of these stitches. Sort of doing a little abstract painting with the thread. And I'm just doing kind of long, straight stitches. You can go in all different directions. But doing something just real loose like this to start with, it's fun to see what you come up with. And it's great that you're not trying to follow a pattern or make a certain image. It's really more of a practice, but it's an artwork in itself. So you can get to know the thread and the needle, how hard you have to pull, how to tie a knot, all of those little details that then once you get into it, you can do more detailed designs if you want to. Again, you can flip this over and see where you're gonna puncture through. But if you go from the back, you can kind of just barely poke your needle through to see where it's going to land. So as I kind of see it just barely kind of pressing from the back, I can see where my needle's going to come through. And it's actually easier to see where your needle's going to land than from the back side because you can't see the front when you flip over your hoop. All right, so then on the back, we're going to tie a knot. I'm going to tie off this purple and move on to doing a couple other little designs on here. So again, I'm going to go under 2 stitches and pull that tight just to make like a little loop. And then go under again. You've got a loop now that you've made. I'm going to take my needle and go through that loop and then pull it tight. And that's just going to lock that in place. You can do it again, or you can tie a knot just like we did at the beginning. think about the back of an embroidery, most of the time for an artwork type, doesn't have to be that secure of a knot. You want it to be tight so that it's not going to fall through or come back through the front of your fabric, but it's not really getting messed with once it's just an art piece of art. If it is a piece that you are maybe putting on clothing or something you're going to use, I would double that knot up a little bit more. Create a tighter knot, pulling that nice and tight, making sure that even if you're wearing it, a little bit of friction rubbing against that knot's going to keep it nice and secure. I'm going to trim off the rest of my thread. We have some fun little stitches going here. Got just, again, an abstract little painting happening with thread. We can do with some additional little shapes and things. I like to switch up the different colors. You can use as many shades as you might want. I'm going to switch to a pink, and we're going to do a couple things like this that look almost like little abstract paint blobs or little brush strokes. And when you put the stitches together tightly like this is what we normally call a satin stitch. And it starts to kind of look like a little bit of satin fabric. It becomes a solid. And so to do that, we are going to have to be a little more diligent about where we're putting our needle so that we're doing the stitches directly next to each other. So we're going to take our next thread and we're going to go back through the eye of our needle. And we're going to tie a knot on the other end. Trim off my extra. Okay, so say I want to do a little satin stitch section right here. I'm going to go from the back again. So whenever you start, you're really always going to start from the back of your embroidery so that your knot's on the back. I'm going to start here. Pull, got a little knot, untangle my yarn. So pull until you hit that knot. And then I'm just going to go down about an inch or so and go back through. Pull that until it's tight again. And then here, I'm going to want them to line up fairly close together. So you can see I kind of can poke just the tip of my needle through my thread or through my fabric to see where it's going to land. And I'm going to go right through fairly close. And then go back down. I'm not worried about my edges lining up. It doesn't have to be a perfect square. We really just want to create a solid with our thread. Then I can go back. I'm going to go up a little bit higher. You can see I'm pulling back through, making sure that I'm right next to where my previous stitches are. And then go back down, kind of right in between those. And do that again. I'm starting to fill in between these. Keeping my stitches tighter this time versus here where we have more of an open weave happening. This, we're keeping our stitches nice and tight together to make a solid area of one type of thread or color. This is if you had something you wanted to fill in, if you were doing some sort of more of a detailed painting style with thread. Or if you had a shape you wanted to fill in, a satin stitch comes in handy for that. And as you can see, I'm not flipping my hoop over. I'm just kind of exploring from the back. So if you start to poke your needle through and you're like, oh, not where I want it, just pull it right back out. And then poke it where you think it should go and then pull it through. And that takes some practice to kind of create this almost X-ray vision that you can kind of just feel where you think the needle should go next. The more and more you do it, but it's more precise pulling it through that way than sometimes if you flip it over, you think you're coming through the right section, even though this kind of looks similar to the front. You think you might be coming through the right section. It might be a little bit higher or a little bit lower than where you want it. And so instead, knowing exactly where your thread's going to come out is helpful. You see, I'm starting to fill this little chunk of space in, just doing little stitches next to each other over and over again. They can overlap a little bit. If you do one that's a little more not straight and it kind of overlaps, that's fine. You can just keep filling it in. Kind of have this little triangling shape happening, and I want to do a similar thing on this side. So I'm just going to start stitching on this side instead. So again, just kind of poking through from the back. And your shapes might be bigger or smaller. Again, we're not using a pattern at all today. We're just experimenting and seeing what we come up with, which is some of my favorite type of art and crafts. You can just kind of do what feels right. All right, so I've got this sort of little diamondy shape happening. If you ever feel like anything like, oh, I think I want to fill in this little piece right here. I've got two stitches and a little gap. Well, I'm just going to come right between those two. Oop, I lost my thread. Again, I'm just going to go right between these two little stitches and pull through. What's great about embroidery as well is a lot of it is very forgiving. If you mess up, say you didn't like the stitch you just made, you could easily take it out. I'm going to take my thread off of my needle. And from the front, you can either grab it with your fingers or you can take your needle and go underneath the stitch you just did and pull that right out. And you can even do it from the back if you were like, oh, I don't want that stitch in there. Do the same thing, kind of see where does this line up on the back. feel around for the right little spot and pull it out. Find this little one here. And then you can start again. I'm done with that little shape. I'm gonna want to tie it off. So I'm gonna take my needle, go through a couple stitches on the back and pull it through. And then loop it again. So I'm gonna go back underneath those stitches again. Pulling until now I've made a little circle here. I can take my needle and go through that circle. And that helps tie it off. And trim off your extra thread. All right, so I'm going to tie the end of my needle again here, or the end of my thread. And you can do some other designs if you want to do something more like a little pattern. For instance, I have this little like stitched edge pattern on this little one, or this one's almost like a little sunshine pattern all the way around. You can do something like that. You can see my fabric's also getting just a little bit saggy, so I'm just going to pull it a little bit tighter. Sometimes if you do a few stitches, it shifts a little bit. Just pull it tight again, and maybe add a couple twists on your little screw at the top to keep it nice and tight. Okay, so say you want to add some details like these little stitches here, basically are going to be like every other stitch. So what we're going to do is, again, we're going to start from our back of our artwork. So we're going to pop our needle through from the back and pull until you hit your knot. And then we're going to just go about a half an inch or so, maybe a little less, and go through to make a single stitch. And then from the back, I can see where my thread's coming out here. I want to go about the equal distance to the next stitch. So from my knot to here, you can measure it if you wanted to. For this, we're just, again, playing around. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and be like, that's about right. And I'm going along the edge of my hoop to make a little border and then pull from the front. And then do that again going down here. So about the same distance. And then you can flip it back over, or you can just poke from behind and pull that thread forward. So you can see I've just got 3 little stitches here, all going in same direction and about equal distances between each other. And this is a great way to do different type of stitch, or a great way to do different types of borders. You can outline things with this type of stitch. Anything like that would all work. And this is what we normally call like a running stitch or a straight stitch. It's just going to be a single one over and over again. And you can see I'm just kind of following the border of my hoop. And then doing approximately the same size stitches all the way around. You can rotate your hoop as you go. And you don't have to do a border. Maybe you're doing your running stitch with me at home, but you can also just continue doing random abstract stitches instead. We're gonna do some little star shapes and some beading as well. I'll show you some of those basics next. All right, as I'm getting to the end of my thread here, I can get one more stitch in. So I can pull it to the back. I'm going to flip it over and tie it off again. And this, since we're doing a little along the edge here, sometimes it can be a little bit tight. It's right by my hoop, but I can still just barely get my needle through there and still pull the same style knot. Go under once, under again to create that little loop, and stick your needle through the loop and pull it tight. I'm going to cut off that. And then you can continue doing more stitches all the way around. And then if you wanted to do a double stitch like this one, you would just continue doing them again right next to the first round. But I'm also going to show you, do some of this fun neon. Pull a little bit of this off of here. How to add on some beads as well, which is super simple. We're going to tie it off on the one end, just like all the other pieces. All right, and then take the other end and thread it through the eye of your needle. So I'm going to poke through the back just like I did on all of our others, making sure that the knot's on the back. So we're going to start from the back side and push through, pull until it hits the knot. And then you can take some beads. Got all these little beads here. And the tricky thing on these beads is that the hole on this bead is pretty small. So I'm going to have to take it off, my thread off my needle, and then push it through. Trim the edge to get a nice clean edge. And then push through the whole of your bead and pull. Then you can push your thread back through and down. And then from here, I'm going to stitch, I'm going to make sure that my bead is tight on here. And then I can push my needle right through my fabric, right where the thread's coming out of my bead. If I want it to be tight right there, grab your needle from the back and pull it down. If you just wanted the single bead, you would then flip it over and you don't want to tie a knot on the back. But if you want to add some more beads, you can just stitch on the back. So I'm going to pop back through over here so that I can do a little overlapping stars over my abstract stitches. I'm going to take that off again and then push it through the whole of the bead. And I'm going to add a couple on here. And as if you kind of pull the end of your thread, get all the fibers going the same direction, can help push it through the smaller beads. And do one more on here. Another trick that is if you get the tip of your thread wet, you can always dip it in water. You can also lick it, which is always a little bit gross, but it's just what works. And then that kind of helps push it through a smaller bead. All right, so once you have as many beads as you want on there, I'm going to put it back onto my needle back on. And then depending on where you want your beaded little strand to go, I kind of want it to go just diagonally here. You can have it be looser if you want them to be able to move. Maybe you want to have a little bit of space for them to shift back and forth. You can kind of play with them, or if you want to be nice and tight. If you want to be tight, you're going to make sure that this is pulled tight and then push your needle right where the thread's coming out. And pull that down. Got our little star beads on there. And from the back, I can tie this off, go to my neighboring stitch, loop it around. Tie a little knot, and then I can cut that off. All right. There you've got that. And then the other little stitch that's a fun one to do that I can show you is these little teeny dots here are fun to make sometimes. They're great to be like the center of a flower or just this. They have like a little knot look. They're actually called a French knot. So to do that, we're going to take some more of our thread here. I'll push it through one side of my needle. And then tie off the other end. Again, we're going to knot that. And then trim it. So to do a little French knot, I'm going to start from the back, push through, and then we're going to loop your thread around your needle. So I'm going to go around, so I'm wrapping my thread around my needle, pulling that tight, and then going back through the same hole I started from. I'll do this a couple times so you guys can see it. And then you want to pull your needle through and pull it tight. Oh, well, my came right through this material here. Let's do that one more time. Okay, so I'm going to pull my thread around my needle, go it around a couple of times, and then just go in a little stitch right next to the first one. And with the thicker needle, it could be a little bit harder, so loosen it up just enough to pull that through. Then you have this little like looped knot on the front. We'll do that again here. Go back. We're going to loop it around a couple of times. You see it twisting around my needle. And I'm just going to go in the hole right next to the hole that I came through. Loosen it enough to pull your larger needle through and then pull it tight. There you have this cute little looped knot. Again, they make great little portions for the for the middle of a flower. That's how you can dot an I if you want to do words. I also just think that they're a fun little texture to add instead of everything being kind of flat. This gives it a little more dimension. We've got a little cluster of French knots. We can tie this off. And there we have some abstract stitches. We've got our running stitch, a satin stitch, a French knot, and even a little bit of bead work. So you guys have seen quite a few of the basic stitches to get you started in all different styles. But I know we talked about using felt and a traditional needle as well. So I'm going to switch over to that so you can see some of those stitches also. So I'm going to start again. One note on our abstracts, I sometimes like to keep some of these always in the rotation. So if you want to try a new stitch out, if you want to practice something, if it's been a minute. So this can also be kind of like a little working piece of art. It's always in progress. You can keep adding to it whenever you want to. If you have a new idea or a new color yarn or thread you got. So this can always be something that you just have, and it's sort of a little practice, almost like an embroidery sketchbook. And you can just keep adding things to it as you go. Or you can be finished with what you did today and you can take it out, you can hang it, you can frame it, and that can just be your abstract art. So there's a couple different styles of what you could do with what we did today. Okay, so to start again, I'm going to take my felt here. I'm going to separate my hoop again. So I've got my two pieces here. I'm going to take my solid hoop on the back, lay my fabric on top, and kind of see my hoop through that. And then I want to unscrew this enough so that it's a little bit more open so that I can get that fabric in between. And then just press my hoop on top and then tighten it. Once I've got that nice and tight, can give a little bit of pressure here, but it's pulled pretty taut. And then can use a traditional needle. And again, these ones have a much smaller eye. You can barely see it on camera here, a little teeny eye, and a much sharper point on the other end. And so these ones can definitely poke you and can hurt. But again, if you're crafting with an adult today and you want to test out a traditional sewing or embroidery needle as well, then I'm going to start with some more thread here and pull off a couple feet. And when you're looking at your embroidery thread, a piece of embroidery thread like this is actually made up of 6 separate tiny threads. So as I kind of fray this in, pull this apart, you can see there's actually 6 separate little threads that makes up one big piece of embroidery thread. So you can separate your embroidery thread into thinner pieces as well. If you want to do a more detailed look, if you want to have variation in your stitches, you want some to be thicker, some to be thinner, then you can separate your thread. So I oftentimes like to separate these in half. So I kind of just take my nail and separate until I can see 3 and 3. So I've got 3 on one side and 3 on the other. And then just slowly pull each side. It sometimes starts to twist a little bit. And just kind of pull side to side until it unravels. All 6 of these little threads are tightly wound together. So as you undo that, it kind of twists back on itself. So I just slowly undo it until I have 2 pieces of thread now, each one made up of 3 tiny threads. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did with our plastic needle, except for sometimes can be a little bit trickier because the eye of our metal needle is much smaller. So again, you can lick the end of your thread or you can dip it in some water, and then you're going to push those little threads right through the eye and then tie a knot on the other side. And splitting the thread is totally an optional thing. You don't have to. You can definitely fit the full 6 strands or the full piece of embroidery thread through a regular needle as well. It just gives you some variation depending on what you want to do. Okay, so just like we did with our plastic needle or with our burlap material, we're going to start from the back. So I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to push through the back. And again, using the metal needle is going to be much sharper. So you want to make sure that your other hand's always on the edge. So I'm holding from the edge of my hoop, not in the middle. If you're holding from the middle of your hoop, one, you're going to start putting more pressure on your fabric, and that can tend to maybe disconnect your hoop a little bit. Putting pressure on this kind of pulls it, and that could distort the image that you're trying to embroider. Plus, the safest thing is to hold your fingers all along the edge of your hoop. That way, when your needle comes through, you're normally not going to be this close to the edge, and your fingers are safe. I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to poke through just the middle of my hoop. You can see it coming through here. I'm going to grab it, my other hand, and pull it tight till I've just got that little knot right in the middle. And then we can do some stitching just the same. And this one, when you're using the metal needle, it kind of just slips right through the felt really easily. So again, holding my hoop from the hoop itself and not the middle, I can push right through the fabric to decide where I want my next stitch to be. Or of course you can turn it over and look from the back. But because now I like to do my little feeling exploration, and you can just see my needle kind of popping through. And your needles are so thin that it's not going to make a bunch of little marks, and you just have to barely tap it through. You can just barely see the little tip of the needle coming through to see if that's where you want it to be. And then you can push it through and pull it from the front. So all the steps are the exact same, working with the plastic needle or a metal needle. The metal needle, the perks is that you can definitely go through a lot of different types of fabric, where a plastic needle is going to be much thicker and sometimes can be a little more challenging to push through a tighter fabric like a felt that we're using. And I'm kind of just crisscrossing over and over again. And just keep looping, making sort of a little star, again, just abstract stitches. And then we're gonna do the same thing on the back to tie it off. I'm gonna go through a couple stitches, pull that tight, go through again. And then in the little loop I just made, take my needle, go up through the loop and pull it tight. And if you wanted to add some beads, if you're using a metal needle, like this one, the little star beads we used earlier, I had to take the needle off, so we're using a plastic needle. If your needle's thin enough to go through, you don't have to take it off. You could just pull it right through with your with the metal needle instead. And then you could just take it off. So let's stitch one of those real quick. Show you that. And take another piece of my thread here. And I'm just gonna carefully go through the eye of my needle with all the little threads. Pull to the other end and tie a knot. All right, so again, we always start from the back. So we're gonna go through the back and pull till we hit the knot. And then I can just take my needle right through my little star bead here. Goes right through. Once that's where I want it to be, I can pop my needle back through my fabric and pull that tight. You could add multiple beads if you wanted to. You wouldn't have to take it off your thread or your needle, just go right back through. And then you can, wherever you want that to land, pop your needle back through your fabric and pull it tight to lock those beads in place. And then on the back, you can tie it off. And trim that, and then you have more little beads. Working with felt or with burlap or fiddler's cloth. There's also so many types of fabric if you wanted to play with denim or canvas. Everything functions a little bit different, and that's what's so fun about embroidery is every time you try a new fabric or a new stitch that it just keeps going and you can come up with lots of different things. And so I hope that you guys had fun practicing some stitches. I know I definitely had fun with you all, and I hope that you get into embroidery and want to craft more with us at Michael's. And happy embroidering. Thanks so much. Have a great day, guys.